The wind one brilliant day called to my soul with an odor of jasmine. And the wind said, in return for the odor of my jasmine, I'd like all the odor of your roses. Chado was about 35 at the time. He'd been working as a high school teacher for 2 or 3 years. He wasn't sure he had a soul. And he said, I have no roses. All the flowers in my garden are dead. And then the wind said, well, then I'll take the yellow leaves and I'll take the withered petals. And the wind left. And I wept. And I said to myself, what have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. I'm the host of the Myth Salon with my partner, Linn. Today, we don't have a Myth Salon, but when Robert Bly passed away on November 21st of this year, we really felt called to do something to bring tribute and honor to somebody who had affected all of our lives. I can remember in the 1980s when I was on a photo shoot, and one of the people I was working with brought and gave me a copy of Iron John, and it just completely transformed my life. I began to raise my kids differently. I began to be a different sort of a team leader. I learned what this idea of the anima or the deep feminine was. And growing up in a patriarchal family, this was not something that I had ever really gave much thought to. I didn't even know about it. And these were long before my days at Pacifica or dealing with myth or depth psychology. So I'm deeply honored to have a role in bringing this tribute forth today. And we have with us Michael Meade, my friend Kwame Scruggs, Dennis Slattery, Connie Zweig. And we hope to have a convergence of stories, exposures to Robert Bly. To get things going, what I'd like to do is run a short film clip produced by a fellow named Haydn Reiss, who has a whole body of work on Robert Bly.
Here's a little poem translated from the Norwegian. May Moon. The May moon goes around like an inspector in a white jacket. The visitors will soon be here. Is everything in its place? This tapestry must be brushed, green rugs everywhere, and candles on the tables. A little music, half muffled, one thrush, a little lark, that's better. And violins, bring up some more small rivers.
He was really into performance. He had a tireless manner. And another thing, that people remember from Robert is, I'll read that line again. And then somebody, a student is reading a poem, and he says, that's wonderful, read it again. And that's actually good.
I remember him so well. He was tall and slim and handsome. He had rosy cheeks. He looked like the all-American boy of the 40s.
When Robert Bly's journal sort of made its first intervention and he began to speak about, quote, a wrong turn in American poetry, he brought another kind of energy into American poetry on behalf of the unconscious, the irrational, and image-centered poetry, a different kind of poetry.
I started a magazine called the 50s and then the 60s, sheerly out of my surprise over what was in Pablo Neruda. I didn't do it for the public. I did it for the poets my own age, because I knew they were just as puzzled as I was.
Robert represented, I think, to younger poets, courage. He had so much of that. It wasn't just the love he showed toward people, he gathered them in.
He created this cauldron where people were really encouraged, feeding the heart, to cultivate their own authority, which contains the word author, their own autonomy.
Neruda says, so happens I'm sick of being a human being. It so happens I'm sick of my fingernails and my toenails and my shadow. So happens I'm sick of being a human being. Nevertheless, it'd be marvelous to kill a law clerk with a cut lily. It'd be tremendous to kill a nun with a blow in the ear. It'd be great to go through the streets with a green knife, letting out yells until I died of the frost. That's a long way from Tennyson.
The early men's gatherings, Robert always used to say, this is not an answer to the women's movement. This is us emulating what they've done forever. You know, we were always behind the newspaper. We were trying to connect and figure this out. So by the time Iron John hit, bam.
He puts himself into some kind of state. I mean, I don't know his actual writing process, but the poems seem to come out of some deep inner state, some deep mind.
And this is a man who worked very, very hard and makes a demand on others that they work hard. It's not easy to be a human being and to become an adult and to go through grief and come out the other side.
This is a poem addressed to people who think, I can't find anything in life that's spiritual. I laugh when I hear that the fish in the water is thirsty. You don't grasp the fact that what is most alive of all is inside your own house, and so you walk from one holy city to the next with a confused look. Kabir will tell you the truth. Go wherever you want, to Calcutta or Tibet. If you can't find where your soul is hidden, for you the world will never be real.
Before we got started, we were all kind of passing some stories, and I was double checking on a memory of mine that really kind of is astonishing to me to be here as we reflected on the year and the passing of time last night with the solstice event. And many of us, whether we were part of that event or not, you know, in that space of reflecting on time. And when I was just a student of Dennis Slattery's, actually, I moved to Ojai with 4 other PhD candidates. We were all just students in the Myth program. And we were starting, we came up with this harebrained idea to start a Joseph Campbell Foundation Mythological Roundtable at the Ojai Foundation. And actually, no, in Ojai. We had no idea of any history. We didn't know what we were or what we were doing, anything like that. And we asked place after place, and we stumbled into the Ojai Foundation, and they said, oh yeah, this is the place. And they went through the list, and they said, this is, you know, Joseph Campbell, James Hillman, Robert Bly, Michael Meade, Joan Halifax, and on and on. And then we thought to ourselves, after a year of holding events there that were very special, we thought maybe someday somebody from the Joseph Campbell Foundation will come and do an event with us, like Bob Walter. This was so long ago. And then we finally hosted an event under the teaching tree. And we introduced that event and every event as this is this place, this is this special place where all these people that had this conversation before us started the conversation and held that conversation for this period of time. And we said Robert Bly's name and Michael Meade's name every event and in these introductions. And so here we are years later, and many of you in the email list for this goes back to those initial events at Ojai and the Ojai Foundation. So special hello to all of you who are here tonight, today. And to me, it's a very special moment to now welcome Michael Meade and to reflect with this event on Robert Bly and this movement that we'll talk about. And not just this movement that they participated in, but this larger movement in mythology and these decades of time that carried the torch into a conversation that we're continuing to have now about myth, who we are, where we are, what we're doing, but also especially about masculinity and the challenges of masculinity and what that means. And sometimes it's a hard conversation to have, and hopefully we can have a little bit of that today. It's my honor to introduce all of us. You guys know Dana, who contributes to the Faculty of Pacifica's Myth PhD program and hosts these events, edits volumes on mythology. My name is Will Linn. I founded mythhouse.org in the general education department at Husson College, where I teach myth to storytellers. And we're here tonight with Kwame, who's been with us before. Kwame Scruggs is the founder of Alchemy, Inc., an organization that uses mythological stories to transform the lives of adolescents. And he's a board member of the Joseph Campbell Foundation and a teacher and doctor of mythology. We're also here with Connie Zweig, a PhD, retired therapist, writer, and shadow expert, a topic on which she's written several volumes, including her most recent bestseller, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, which, and as a friend of Connie's, we should all congratulate her, won both the 2021 American Book Fest Award and the 2021 Best Indie Book Award for Best Inspirational Nonfiction. Dennis Patrick Slattery is a distinguished emeritus professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and he is the author and co-author, editor, or co-editor of 30 volumes of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, including his latest collection, The Way of Myth. His paintings, pottery, writing, and upcoming events can be found at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. And our very special guest today, Michael Meade, is a renowned storyteller, author, and scholar of mythology, anthropology, and psychology, who combines hypnotic storytelling, street-savvy perceptiveness, and spellbinding interpretations of ancient myths with a deep knowledge of cross-cultural rituals. He has an unusual ability to distill and synthesize these disciplines, tapping into ancestral sources of wisdom and connecting them to the stories we're living today. He's the author of Awakening the Soul, The Genius, Myth, Fate, and Destiny, The Two Agreements of the Soul, Why the World Doesn't End, The Water of Life, Initiation in the Tempering of the Soul. And he's an editor with James Hillman and Robert Bly of Rag and Bones, Shop of the Heart, and the creator of the Living Myth podcast. Also founder of Mosaic Multicultural Foundation, a nonprofit network of artists, activists, and community builders that encourages greater understanding between diverse peoples. Thanks for being with us and leading this tribute today, Michael.
Thank you for inviting me. Good to be with everyone. I'll read a short poem by Robert as a way of introducing his poetic voice and then comment on it. This one is called Passing an Orchard by Train. Grass high under the apple trees, the bark of the trees rough and sexual, the grass growing heavy and uneven. We cannot bear disaster, not like the rocks swaying nakedly in the open fields. One slight bruise and we die. I know no one on this train. A man comes walking down the aisle, and I want to tell him that I forgive him and that I want him to forgive me. Kind of quintessential Robert in a way. He grew up in the plains of Minnesota, and so you get the orchard and his connection to the land. And then suddenly he makes one of these moves. Robert, when we used to work together, he used to call it running the rapids. We'd put out an announcement, we're doing such and such events. By the time we got to there, we were thinking about something else. And so we'd do a different event. And people say, wait a minute, I signed up for this. They said, yeah, but you don't know. The river of life could take you anywhere. And we would just start with no plan and run the rapids. And what that meant was let the flow of imagination come. And you see it in his poems. To say that the trees are rough and sexual, surprising kind of image. Next thing, he just jumps and says, we can't bear disaster. Where did that come from? And as he's working on that, a man comes walking down the aisle who then gets incorporated into the poem, and the issue becomes, can I forgive him? Can he forgive me? And that opens up this connection Robert Bly had to the soul. So that all of his events and every event I ever did with him, he's always cracking open the doors to the unseen members of each of our soul. And he was always cracking open the doors of emotion, which is something I had never seen before I met him, that someone could stand on stage and find ways through poetry and other kinds of speaking to crack open the doors of emotion, and an audience of people who didn't know each other suddenly are all feeling the flow of emotions. It was a radical experience. And it came from deep places of knowledge. I mean, Robert was one of the smartest people when it comes to poetry in the country. He knew more, he knew the poetry, not just of United States poets, from all over the world. He translated poets from many different languages. He made them well known here. I mean, people might not have heard about Rumi in this country except for Robert, and Machado, and it goes on. It's a long list. He was standing in the midst of the old stream of Western mysticism, and channeling it through Rilke and through many, many other sources, Goethe and so on. And that was him, big like that, and a kind of a huge soul. And the connection to myth was, for him, was telling fairy tales. And so he had another foot in the realm of myth. And so by way of memorial, I want to recall something I had read before I met Robert from Miguel de Unamuno, who is a great Spanish philosopher and poet. And he said that it's the job of each person to become irreplaceable, to live their own life so fully that when they pass on, everyone feels that something is missing in the world, to become irreplaceable. And I would say that Robert is one of the first people I ever met who was clearly, from the beginning, my experience of him, irreplaceable. In his case, he was also irrepressible, because he was a big presence. But that bigness was connected to this deep soul. And he was a man of great generosity in many ways. For instance, he just opened doors for me. I don't even know what the beginning of that was. He just would invite me to things that he was doing, and I would be on stage and like at Ojai and all kinds of places, and we would be running the rapids, just trying to open the doors of imagination wide enough that everybody present could slip into it. And he had a recklessness about that. Like someone comes upon a forest and some people in the group start to figure out engineering things, how we could put a road through the forest, and Robert just walks in, pushes the branches away, and begins an adventure. And I learned from him sometimes that's the right thing to do. And so he had that kind of power, and he had that kind of presence that was anchored, as you were mentioning, Data, to the deep sense of the feminine, the deep sense of the soul, to the anima, as Jung called it. And so I just should mention that by the time things got to what became called the men's movement, which we actually called men's work, Robert had already been doing conferences on the Great Mother, conferences on the deep feminine, and then what became best known was men's work. But the work of many, many decades in poetry, in mythology, in mysticism, Robert was bringing in teachings from the Middle East, Sufi teachings, and bringing in the mystical poets. I mean, he was like a great river flowing with many tributaries. And he was, and for me, is irreplaceable.
Say something like this: grapes turn to wine, they long for our ability to change. When the stars go around the North Pole, they are longing for our growing consciousness. Wine got drunk with us, not the other way.
He sometimes doesn't seem to live in this world at all. He seems to be living in maybe several worlds at once.
I was plowing in a long field. I would memorize one quatrain of Omar Khayyam every time I came. One time I got so fascinated by what was in it that I kept going and drove into the ditch and turned the tractor over.
Bly's work as a translator has changed not only how we live as readers, but definitely how we live as writers.
To cultivate their own authority.
It wasn't just the love he showed toward people, he gathered them in.
What actually was happening, the depth of it, the kind of beauty of it, the surprise of it, was not what became known.
Bly puts himself into some kind of deep inner state. The poems seem to come out of some deep mind.
There's something men and women living in houses don't understand. The old alchemists, standing near their stoves, hinted at it 1,000 times.
Robert, you wasted so much of your life sitting indoors to write poems. Would you do that again? Ah, I would, 1,000 times.
That gives a good feeling for the man. And he would read the poem again of his own choosing. I'll read that again. And he'd say, the soul can't get it all the first time. You have to read it a second time in order to let it get into your soul. So that was very unlike the more academic poetry readings that were going on at the time.
Robert filled my life with creative joy. From his early work, you know, some of you might think for me, it's about a little book for the human shadow, in which he told the entire story of shadow work in one sentence, which was the first half of our life. We stuff everything into the long bag, and then we spend the second half taking it out again. But his impact on me continued before that, preceded that, and came after that. For example, his poem, A Third Body, I'm going to read it to you now. This poem became the vision of my marriage, and it became the central theme of Romancing the Shadow. A man and a woman sit near each other, and they do not long at this moment to be older or younger, nor born in any other nation or time or place. They're content to be where they are, talking or not talking. Their breaths together feed someone whom we do not know. The man sees the way his fingers move. He sees her hands close around a book she hands to him. They obey a third body that they share in common. They've made a promise to love that body. Age may come, parting may come, death will come. A man and a woman sit near each other. As they breathe, they feed someone we do not know, someone we know of whom we have never seen. What he could do with words was paint from the imagination all these things that we know, but we don't know. And he was actually able to conjure them into our realities. When he, Michael mentioned News of the Universe. I think that was probably maybe my first exposure to Robert, and I highly recommend that collection. I hope Michael talks about the later collection of the Rag and Bone Shop, but the News of the Universe, Poems of Twofold Consciousness. He actually used poetry to explore the evolution of human consciousness. And then I'm going to read one more, and that's because this poem gave words to the whispers of my soul that I had felt all my life for as long as I can remember, and had never even tried to articulate it. And this is The Holy Longing by Goethe, translated by Robert Bly, which once I found this poem, it became my PhD dissertation. And then it became a book. Tell a wise person or else keep silent. For those who do not understand will mock it right away. I praise what is truly alive, what longs to be burned to death. In the calm waters of the love nights where you were begotten, where you have begotten, a strange feeling creeps over you as you watch the silent candle burning. Now you're no longer caught in the obsession with darkness, and a desire for higher lovemaking sweeps you upward. Distance does not make you falter. Now, arriving in magic, flying, and finally insane for the light. You are the butterfly, and you are gone. And so long as you've not experienced this, to die and so to grow, you're only a troubled guest on this dark earth. Thank you, Robert.
I'd like to read something from this selected poems of Neruda and Vallejo. But first I want to ask Michael, because I'm fascinated with the art of translating someone's words, poetry or prose, from their language into yours. And what goes on in that migration, I just find one of the great mysteries of translators and working that art form. So Michael, I'm wondering if you all ever had any conversations about translating, all of the translating that Robert did throughout his life.
Good question. Very controversial subject, actually,
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to Rumi and Hafez, coming from the ancient traditions in Persia, what used to be called Persia, and those poets being so essential to the philosophical, mystical understanding of the traditions in that area of the world. And strangely, I was present when Robert kind of gave Coleman Barks the assignment of translating Rumi. Coleman had come to Rumi on his own, but we were all talking about poetry and so on, and Robert wanted to tell Coleman, you have to translate Rumi for everybody. And of course, Coleman became famous as the translator of Rumi. And then I know we had the film from Haydn, and Haydn did a film called Rumi, Poet of the Heart. And so I show up at the set, which has been improvised because it had to be moved for that. And the first question he asks me is, could you explain how Rumi, a poet from the Middle East, becomes the most popular poet in the United States? How does that happen? It even slips by, and it works by way of humor. It works by way of stunning imagery. It works in many different ways, as if to keep bringing people to some deep human well.
He was an intense, fierce mountain meditator. Those kind of people, like Thoreau, magnified 5 times.
And the only thing I could say, I don't remember what I said, but my thought was something about sometimes poetry is so strong that it can move from one language to another and carry enough of the earth, of the origin of the poetry, that it can replant itself in a different language. It's a mystery.
Wow.
And I will say, ever since that Rumi became popular, and then following that Hafez, there's been this big controversy. How many of the poems in that style that are in English are actually translations? And I know originally Robert and I think Coleman also were using the term versions, as if the translation can't be literal to literal. As a matter of fact, if you read literal translations, they don't work. So it's almost like the poetry of the translator is being the midwife in the process of rebirthing the poetry from one language to another. And then people can have lots of disagreements about that and say, well, that word was never there. And I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But what happens to me is if I'm reading Rumi, lines occur to me that are not there. And I have to decide, am I allowing them to come in? So what I've done personally is just consult Rumi and Hafez and others and ask them, is this the wrong thing to do? And they seem to be okay.
Yeah.
I'm joking, but you know what I'm saying.
But,
It's
right,
a
no,
mystery. It's a mystery. And
It
if
is.
someone can capture the spirit of the poet and the poetry, then I think that's a service. Imagine the Western world, without knowing the mystics of the Middle East, or Kabir from India, or people who come up in the Anglo culture, not knowing Neruda or Jimenez or Machado. A tremendous loss on the level of poetry and on the level of humanity. So I think there's a kind of a service that will never be clearly defined, that you can tell when the poetry is still there and when it's not, but it's a mystery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Robert brought Kabir into Western culture. Who knew Kabir? And so that's a great service. And then for those being very close about the language, it's a disservice.
Yes.
Me, I'm going to ride with the presence of poetry and the freedom to allow it to find a new birth through the body and the soul of other people, if it's done with love and care. And to me, not much harm done, because the literal translations, or the more accurate ones, if someone wants to say that, probably can be searched out.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. May I just read, let me read just one, because Robert's introductions to Neruda and Vallejo are really poetry in prose. So at the beginning of this, entitled Reading Neruda and Vallejo in the 1990s, Robert writes this: "Why is it important to read Pablo Neruda now? Because after 12 years of Reagan and Bush, we find in him a well of compassion. His mother's death, his father's death, the rain broke upon his heart. We look in and see compassion for adolescents, for workers, for school teachers, for the loneliness of salt." I mean, it's just magnificent end of that first paragraph. And let me just read a tad more. "Competent, chill-hearted, respectable workshop poems flood North American bookstores. But opening Pablo Neruda's poems, readers bite into sea potatoes, Chilean lions made of sugar, drops of marmalade and blood, a hurricane of gelatin, a tail of harsh horsehair, elephants that fall from the sky. As Neruda says, a tongue of rotten dust is moving forward over the cities. Movie posters in which the panther is wrestling with thunder." I'll stop there, and if there's time down the road, I would love to read something about his intro to Vallejo. But to read him introducing another poet, he's, and I think Michael's word is not overused here, he really enters the soul of this person who he's translating, and then creates a poem that cocoons it.
Is there something about his mythic interests and archetypal interests that enabled him to be a successful midwife of these poems?
Well, he was also being a midwife to the realm of fairy tales, which is kind of an aspect of the mythological realm. And so when Robert's writing Tales of the Universe, he's also trying to reconnect everybody to the mythological background of human culture. And so, yeah, they're all, the thing is, it's so modern to try to categorize someone, and Robert defied that. Too many facets, too many tendrils, too many thunderstorms coming out, and too many elephants dropping by. And it really was, it was mythological, most of what he was doing. And his way of being in the poem was deeply personal and mythological at the same time. And I mean, that's how I got involved. That's how I got attracted. Robert was telling stories and I had just started telling stories. And we would have lots of conversations about mythic images. And when he was doing poetry workshops, he would be trying to introduce the poets, not to how to get a functional poem, but how to let the myth pull you into a territory of your own soul that you hadn't found yet, and then deliver the news from there. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, you know, when it became Robert and James Hillman and I, and we got associated or identified with men's work, and people used to come up to me and say, I want to do what you guys are doing. How do I do that? I want to apprentice. And I would say, well, let's see. Robert's writing poetry, interpreting myths, and kind of trying to deliver ancient knowledge to the contemporary world. James is a philosopher turned psychologist, trying to crack open the shell around the beings and the non-beings in the world, and trying to release knowledge every step he takes. And I'm a student of mythology and a student of ritual, trying to find ways to take ancient stories and make them real for people now. Which one are you interested in doing? You know, I was trying to say, we're not doing what you think we're doing. That we're not, we're doing what people used to do. We're trying to reconnect the ancient parts of the soul with the current life that we're living. And Dennis, it's great that you brought in Neruda. And right at the beginning, Robert is saying Neruda was involved in politics. He was a poet, and in this ancient tradition where the poet is speaking the truth about political situations. And that's another thing that Robert embodied and demonstrated, which poets are supposed to bring the truth forth. The old idea is, if the poet isn't speaking the truth, the muses will depart. And so the poet is, you know, I mean the deeper truth, not the facts of the matter, but the facts of life. And that was something that Robert did continuously, instinctively, and freely. And that gave me a big permission to make the world bigger for my own self. And I know that he did that for many, many people. And I have to say one other thing, and I know that Kwame understands this thing I'm going to, because Robert would bring in all kinds of poets and people that were brilliant that were not known. And one of them was Etheridge Knight, who was one of the great American poets, but was not known as a great American poet because he was considered a Black poet. And Etheridge was brilliant. And Etheridge had this great courage that Robert also recognized. And we would do these events where everyone in the audience was white. And here was Etheridge right in the middle, saying his poems, backed up by Robert's kind of confidence in him and love for him. And that was meaningful too. I'm trying to give a sense of how broad it was and how kind of shattering of common conceptions it would be if you were hanging out with Robert. Something was always about to happen, and as soon as it was starting to happen, he would be making it bigger and more reckless and more challenging and more beautiful. And that is the greatest acts of permission I've ever seen. And he had an instinct for connecting people that wouldn't find each other otherwise. And I see Gary Snyder in the film there, and it was great. Gary Snyder, we were doing events in a remote camp, and Gary Snyder came in with a backpack, the biggest backpack I've ever seen, with pickaxes and all kinds of tools. I thought, what do you think? We're on a kind of archaeological dig, but that's how he was, like a digger, and he wanted to be there as a digger. And I missed some of those events because they were so radically poetic, because of the number of unusual souls that Robert would bring in. And then afterwards, they're characterized this way or that. But if you were in them, it was like going back in time and kind of back into really to the mythic level of things. And Robert was a genius at that.
When we announced this event, we got an email from Rebecca Armstrong telling a story of her time, an event experience with Robert Bly. And she said that they basically broke into university after they were at a school. It had been shut down. It was after hours. They found an empty classroom, took it over, and in the middle of the night just started telling poetry to everybody. And but you mentioned this phrase, acts of permission. And she really focused in on this one story where she saw this young man who was, having a hard time delivering his poem with confidence and energy. And she talks about him and she used the word midwifing as well, just him just midwifing and encouraging and pushing and giving, permission for this man to show up. And she's recalling this, decades later of witnessing him, bringing this young man's energy into himself. And it was so interesting. I came across this email. It was a week or two late with me opening it, but it was just after I had been at the faculty party for my school where we have actors. And the head of the acting program had shared this story of, feeling, am I uncomfortable? Can I do this? But there was this kid and I just knew he needed pushed. And I pushed him and I did, and I watched, and this beautiful thing happened, and he came forward and emerged. And it was the same story that I had just gone from hearing into hearing that night. And my understanding is that that's one of the things that he brought to a lot of people and to the world, even to his readers. And anyway, really cool to hear you mention these acts of permission and these grand experiences and nights and events with such a larger than life human being.
One of the things that I think happened is, or can happen, when a person becomes themselves, they are able to bless other people. Often they're able to curse other people as well. But there's an old African saying, you only want to be blessed by someone who could curse you, right? Because that proves it's a genuine blessing. Because the opposite is also possible, then the blessing is more genuine. And Robert blessed people. And he taught a lot of us to bless, that it can't be simply about one's own life. That's not enough. The soul is instinctively, intuitively connected to other lives. And he knew that in a really unusual way and gave a lot of permission for a lot of us to find our way and find ways to connect to other people as well. And he did it with this ferocity that he also had, which is another kind of permission, which is a lot of what was behind Iron John, was actually permission for men to find a deeper sense of soul and the quality that Robert called wild, which when it became popular, became distorted. Wildness without the soul connection is damaging. He was talking something much closer. I can imagine him reading Novalis or something and talking about how the ancient poets would wander all night through the starry night as the stars were moving. They would wander over the fields, waiting for the intimation of poems to come from the ground or wherever. And so wildness was that. And wildness also was, as Connie was saying, wildness was facing the shadow, and wildness was connecting to the feminine side of the soul. And so the wildness was not the Wild West. It was the wildness of the informed wilderness or the inner forest or the inner poet or whatever. And so, and he exhibited that, which was a blessing.
He also never got too far away from his body. And as he was speaking and he was walking around, his arms moved. Everything about him was connecting him to the place that he seemed to be standing or being on the earth. And the sense of that chthonic, visceral inhabiting his gut. He was unapologetic about the way in which he came forth using his body as an instrument to communicate.
True enough, true enough. And would encourage other people in the retreats. There would be all kinds of practices, that people would be expected to try. And I think one of Robert's big intuitions was how damaging an excess of shame can be to people. If I had to connect Robert to emotion specifically, I think I would name the sense of love of beauty as one, and the sense of a deep feeling for shame as the other. And he took his own personal, which is another aspect of Robert. He would be putting his life out as the example, and he would talk with the kind of Viking courage about the shame laid on him through the family, and not just the family, but the entire community that was caught in this kind of Protestant forms of shaming. And he would be arguing for the idea that most of us are carrying not just the shadow bag of the repressed parts of ourselves, but also the excess shame in our families. And I can hear him, that the shame tanks inside a person are only so big. And then we have our own shame, but then our families put all the family inherited shame on us, and that fills the tanks, and we're being pulled down constantly by the shame. I mean, he really would be a student of the emotion. And again, he was given permission, saying, we have to release our bodies from the shame that we inherit that makes us think we should have someone else's body. That's one of the big industries in America, is trying to wind up with someone else's body. and Robert had it the other way around. No, we have to accept the body we have. That is because the body and the soul are one. So I agree with you. He was an embodied poet, and he was a person working from the emotions encased in the body in a way that was aimed at healing.
Hey, Michael mentioned the African concept. Before I get to the African concept, Connie, thanks for your tears. They say the soul would have no rainbow, had the eyes no tears. Really appreciate being here. But Michael mentioned the African concept. There's another African concept that what they said, when people die, they live on in three ways. One is by their offspring. The second is by their good deeds, and the third is when you call out their name. So just wanted to pay tribute to Robert Bly by saying, when I read Iron John the first time, Dana saying with me, it was the first time I ever read like a myth and had interpretation, and it hit me, but it didn't really hit me. It wasn't until I read Meade's book, Men in the Water of Life, with the different myths that really hit me, that you could use that. And then I read Iron John again, maybe about 15 years later or so. So it was like 15 years ago. And they say if a book is not worth reading twice, it's not worth reading once. But it was from reading his book that second time that really blew me away. So just want to honor him by saying, like 2 years ago, we worked with our youth through the myth of Iron John, and we worked with it for like about 22 weeks. And Michael, you were talking about opposites, and then Connie with the whole shadow. And like in the beginning of Iron John, they say something has gone awry, something has gone wrong. And we asked our youth what has gone wrong in their life. And so they started to, say things had gone wrong. But then we asked them the opposite, what has gone right in their life. So just honoring him by saying, wow, I don't know if when he wrote that book, if he imagined urban youth in Akron, Ohio, spending 20 weeks, studying his book. But that's how I just want to honor him. So, and hey, it's difficult. I look at Dennis and Michael as being mentors, and in Myth, I learned, through Myth, when you have a mentor, you just sit there and shut up. So, hey, I'm done talking. All right. Okay.
Thank you, Kwame.
I work with college students, people trying to come of age, and sometimes even come of gender. And I wonder, we talk about the men's movement. I wonder, do you think, and I hope this isn't a controversial question, but do you think that this material will be valuable for trans men or individuals seeking to develop a gendered consciousness beyond just maybe, I don't know if it was originally made for, men just to find themselves, or if this material has always been or could be valuable to a kind of a world today where gender is going today. Is it still valuable to everyone?
I would say yes. Back in the day when Robert had started working with women and men and really focused on the feminine. And then I remember him saying, after I got to know him, he was saying, I think we need to do something with men because I'm a father and I don't know exactly what to say to my sons. And I don't even know what to say to my father. And I said, yeah, second the emotion. And so then he got the idea, let's just get men together and do this. And so, again, contrary to a lot of people might think, it was soul work. It just happened to be soul work in a group of men. And a lot of the notions then were very binary. There's the masculine and the feminine. And honestly, that's not terribly mythological. That's much more sociological. And so one of the things I learned from working with people with diverse backgrounds of all kinds is, if a story is told in a way that is compelling, I always ask everybody, where would we find you in the story? And so if it's done that way, then people will find the part of the story that gives them a doorway in, or they will find the part of the story that says you can't come in. Either way, they come in, whether through saying, I'm a trans person, or I'm somewhere on the arc of sexuality and gender considerations, which is what's going on now. And I find that the ancient stories can usually carry and help transform the issues of the day, whatever day it is. And one of the things that's going on now is the binary conceptions of gender are being dissolved, like many other institutional conceptions in culture. And I think we're left with more of an arc where people can find themselves on that arc in different places, even at different times of their life. And myth allows that. Myth allows that. And when we were doing men's work, we had trans men, we had cross-dressing men, we had all kinds. And I'll tell you what was really pertinent about it. There were only two rules. We'd all be 7-8 days in a remote forest, 100 or so men, eventually quite diverse. And the two rules, one was introduced by Etheridge Knight, who's standing up at an event where he recognized he was probably the only white guy in the event. He said, I would just ask for everybody, could we have no physical violence? That was the first rule, no physical violence. Everyone can be as present as fully as they need to be, which could be the expression of deep anguish and anger coming from generations that needs to come out, but we wouldn't go to violence. That was the first rule. And then the second rule really was, would you not leave the room? So in other words, talking in terms of the shadow, let's bring the shadow in for a change. Let it be in the room. Let people pronounce their understanding or their feeling about it, even though those feelings are very contrary. Let's have it all in the same room and not go to violence and not abandon each other. And in that situation, every aspect of humanity shows up, and every aspect can be dealt with. I mean, of course, in America, race is going to come in a big way, and it should. Handle it honestly, be fully present with it for 48 hours or 72 hours, and it utterly transforms. People see each other differently. The molecules inside people adjust. Bring in homophobia. When you have homophobic men in the room, no battling and no leaving. And all of a sudden, everybody has to realize, we would sometimes leave the room and someone would be saying, okay, I get it now. we're all gay and we're all black. And I'm just trying to make a joke about how everybody would find their connection to essential things. And that kind of thing is so healing for those that are present, and they represent a capacity for healing in the culture. So yes, and the basis of it would be a commitment to being present with the soul. And also, we would frame it with mythological stories, poetry, and songs. And so that you had healing elements and deeply meaningful elements that were the real vessel. And then you go into the alchemy, in which, and in the alchemical vessel constructed in that frame, anything can be handled. I mean, you know, people confess to murder in front of everybody when there's no statute of limitation, because they had to get it off their chest and it had to be held somewhere. And the soul has to get big enough to say yes. Maybe like that man on the poem in Robert's poem on the train, has to be forgiven. I mean, that's what the work was about. And so everybody had to learn early on. There are trans people, there are people who are in this element or this area of gender and so on, that weren't there before, they're there now, and they may be somewhere else later. That was the work. And Robert had the soul size for that. When we did the first multicultural, interracial men's retreats, you know, Robert came and was part of that. So did James. I mean, that was, if we're going to embrace the soul is all facets of all people that have ever been. And of course, it's the exact opposite of how we live now. We live in a kind of continually losing soul kind of culture. And when soul's the connective tissue of life, when soul is lost, things get divided, things get oppositional. When things are polarized, it's a lack of soul that is the clear cause. I mean, you know, the issues we have are not going to be solved by committees. And I hope committees can do smart things. But the issue is loss of soul. And that was the nature of, that's what I learned from Robert early on. You take a risk because it might bring the soul more present. You stay in the midst of an argument or someone in the audience says, I don't believe you. And you accept that and say, okay, let's see where we can go from there. Because that expansion of soul is going to cause another person sitting nearby to speak up about their life or to learn something about their life. That was the essence of the work. It's just the same thing as the poetry, right? The muses deliver some words. Are you going to edit it because of you know, something your family thought about? Or you are going to accept the muses and then put your body and your own soul behind it and publish it as a poem? That, I mean, to me, that was the essence of what everyone was trying to do.
I have daughters and I have sons. Who's out there at 6 a.m.? The man throwing newspapers onto the porch, and the roaming souls suddenly drawn down into their sleeping bodies. Wild words of Jacobema go on praising the human body, but heavy words of the ascetics sway in the fall gales. Do I have a right to my poems, to my jokes, to my loves? Oh, foolish man, knowing nothing less than nothing about desire. I have daughters and I have sons. When one of them lays a hand on my shoulder, shining fish turn suddenly in the deep sea. At this age, I especially love dawn on the sea, stars above the trees, pages in the threefold life in the pale faces of baby mice. Perhaps our life is made of struts and paper, like those early Wright brothers planes. Neighbors run along holding the wingtips. I do love Yeats's fierceness as he jumped into a poem, and that lovely calm in my father's hands as he buttoned his coat. Keeping our small boat afloat. So many blessings have been given to us during the first distribution of light that we are admired in 1,000 galaxies for our grief. Don't expect us to appreciate creation or to avoid mistakes. Each of us is a latecomer to the earth, picking up wood for the fire. Every night another beam of light slips out from the oyster's closed eye. So don't give up hope that the door of mercy may still be open. Seth and Shem, tell me, are you still grieving over that spark of light that descended with no defender near into the Egypt of Mary's womb? It's hard to grasp how much generosity is involved in letting us go on breathing when we contribute nothing valuable but our grief. Each of us deserves to be forgiven, if only for our persistence in keeping our small boat afloat when so many have gone down in the storm. Stealing sugar from the castle. We are poor students who stay after school to study joy. We are like those birds in the India mountains. I am a widow whose child is her only joy. The only thing I hold in my ant-like head is the builder's plan of the castle of sugar. Just to steal 1 grain of sugar is a joy. Like a bird, we fly out of darkness into the hall, which is lit with singing, and then fly out again. Being shut out of the warm hall is also a joy. I'm a laggard, a loafer, and an idiot. But I love to read about those who caught 1 glimpse of the face and died 20 years later in joy. I don't mind your saying I will die soon. Even in the sound of the word soon, I hear the word you, which begins every sentence of joy. Ah, you're a thief, the judge said. Let's see your hands. I showed my calloused hands in court. My sentence was 1,000 years of joy.
Well, just thanks again, Connie, for recommending that. Thanks, Dana. Hey, just watching him. I never met him, but just being here feels like he's here. And while Michael, I got this quote from you. They said, "When death comes to find you, let it find you alive." And they said it's better to die a broken piece of jade than to live a life of clay. So I'm just saying, this is so cool to honor him like this, because wow, he's like here. So thank you.
Yeah, you can see that joy, and he'll talk about the stone hands and then he'll be back at the joy. And he had that joy for life. And he had that sense that before I die, I will have lived, and that's a teaching done in the body, in the presence, which then comes through in the poetry as well. Yeah, I mean, a really large soul capable of big ideas, beautiful images, brokenheartedness, and yet generosity and ferocity. And you had to kind of get big enough to be in the room with a really wide range of emotions and imagination that ran all the way from the Vikings just crashed through the door to we're bending down to observe blue flowers that just arisen from the snow. You just had to be able to go the whole range, you know, and that's why sometimes I get a little testy about reducing it to something that could be categorized or conceptualized, because it really was the life and the work of the soul.
Michael, would you say something about the making of Rag and Bone Shop?
Sure. It was a great thing. So James Hillman and Robert Bly and I had been doing events of all kinds together for years. And I thought it was time, it's kind of like a band. It was like, I thought it was time for more solo albums. And I used to discuss it with James, well, you know, have we reached the end of this road? What should we do? So my sense was that we were close to the end of whatever the road was. And I wanted to have a something that would show what we did, something that would show what we were doing together. And so I proposed that we do a book of essays, is where I started from, that we do a book of essays together. And then the primary editor at the publisher's house said, well, the poems are so essential to what you all do. Why don't you do essays and poems? So, and then HarperCollins agreed to do it. I don't think you could make the book now because of getting the permissions and paying for all the copyrights. And they agreed to do that. But partially, they just thought it was a beautiful idea. And so then people set to work. And the way we worked is we would meet, we would go to a place, a city, to do an event. And then after the event, we would stay for 3 days. And we were each required to bring poems that we wanted to put into the book. And we did that 5 times or 6 times. And then we would spend the 3 days arguing over which poems go in the book. I mean, and I say arguing, it was mostly poetic arguing, although every once in a while it would be just regular arguing. And so we would have 3 categories. A poem that gets all 3 votes, that's in the book. A poem that gets 2 out of 3, one of us is against it, goes into a separate pile. And if a poem only got 1 vote, it was out. I actually have all the poems that we didn't put in, I have in a book, but I don't know that you could ever do a book like that again. But anyway, and of course, negotiating with Robert is a really wild experience. And let me just say, he cheats. So I would be opposed to a poem he was bringing in, and he would try to bribe Hillman to back it up so that it could still be in the second pile. And so it was really funny, and it was really intense, and it was really beautiful. And the one thing, so it's a great collection of poems, and it's like every time you read it, you find a poem. Even I find a poem I didn't know was in there, and so it seemed like a fitting way to symbolically show what we were really doing. And it turned out strangely that each of us loved Yeats. The beginning of the first men's retreat that we did, which had no form whatsoever because it had never been done before. And we were late. And so everybody who was there got agitated. And so they started carrying on, and people were climbing the walls. I don't know what they were all doing. And so having no plan, Robert says to me, why don't you start? And I've never even been in such a situation, but I used to carry several drums, one of which was a bodhrán, the Irish drum. You play with a stick. And I thought, well, I'm going to defend myself with my Irish drum, and I'm going to recite Yeats while playing this Irish drum. And that's how the event started. And everybody calmed down because of the ancient nature of the poem and the drum. And it was only later that Robert said to me, it was reading Yeats that I decided to commit my life to poetry. So we had this connection because we both studied and loved Yeats.
The ignominy of boyhood, the distress of boyhood changing into man. The unfinished man and his pain brought face to face with his own clumsiness.
And then when James Hillman came in and joined, he was a student of Yeats as well. So sometimes we would actually read a Yeats poem together, all three of us. And so when you see Rag and Bone Shop, that's a line from a Yeats poem. And now I must lay down where all the ladders start in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And so that was a thing that we all had a connection to Yeats, and that was the last significant thing in a way that we did together. And people have referred to it as like the band, you know, the band breaks up and people go do solo albums or whatever. But that was how it started. And the process was just amazing, to listen to hundreds and hundreds of poems and for days, you know, month after month, and then find the collection and begin writing little essays. So yeah, it's a beautiful production that came kind of at the end of that road we were on.
I'm thinking that part of his poetry and his soul was nurtured by living lifelong in a habitat where there are seasonal changes.
This is a poem called Winter Poem, and I think it's a poem for those that have felt a lot of shame perhaps in childhood or distance. And then there's always a danger that instead of becoming a mammal, you sort of put a shell around yourself and have a hard surface like the ant or the beetle. It's called Winter Poem. The quivering wings of the winter ant wait for lean winter to end. I love you in slow, dim-witted ways, hardly speaking, one or two words only. What caused us each to live hidden? A wound, the wind, a word, a parent. Sometimes we wait in a helpless way, awkwardly, not whole and not healed. When we hid the wound, we fell back from a human to a shelled life. Now we feel the ant's hard chest, the carapace, the silent tongue. This must be the way of the ant, the winter ant, the way of those who are wounded and who want to live, to breathe, to sense another, and to wait.
And I really am struck by how Robert Bly seemed to have embodied that northern central part of America. He seemed Minnesotan to the core.
I can see Gary Snyder on the crag of a California mountain
He's
waving his pickaxe,
Sierra Goat.
saying, "Be careful what you say." Yeah, but I think his first, I think he might have won the National Book Award for Silence in Snowy Fields. So there was a part of Robert that was always in the field somewhere. And as much as he was expressive and, big voice and big presence in public situations, he could disappear into some internal snowy field as well. And of course, he understood that he was coming from Scandinavian farming backgrounds. Interesting thing was that he didn't quite fit into it. Is from what he told me, his older brother was the farmer who was taking over the farm, and his older brother, in that sense, was, I think, sat more. His father's eyes fell on the older brother, who was going to be the farmer, and not on Robert. And so, and that's in Robert's poems too, trying to reach the father. And then his mother's eyes fell on him. Robert was really blessed more by the mother than by the father, and he had the longing for the father. But he was the golden child in his mother's eyes. This is the way he would tell me about it. And his brother, who was older, was the father's favorite. But then his brother died tragically in a farming accident. And that was a big deal for Robert. And that's what part of what brought him to the issues of shame, because he had never reconciled with his brother and things like that. But Robert knew he was from Scandinavian farming stock, and that was the connection partly to the body. But then this other thing was in him that, when it awakened, took him off to Harvard eventually. And so that's, he was always going back to Minnesota and used to be up to the lake when they lived on the lake, and up there in the winters and so on. But his soul went so many other places that was different, I think, from the family background and the sense of being located in the farming areas of the Midwest. And certainly his psyche, when he was doing those poetry books, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, he was talking to poets in America saying, we have to have these connections, to South America and Central America and ancient places, that's part of our inheritance too. That was what he was doing with News at the Universe, I think, and with especially those poetry books in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were profound. They really did, as someone was saying in the film, change the kind of poetic zoning of America, I think. So yeah, he's grounded in that, the four seasons of Minnesota, and yet he was also a person of the many seasons that appear in all kinds of places. And that makes him a translator from one place, one zone to another.
Well, he seemed to transcend time. So he kept looking back to Rumi.
He often says things, well, I don't do the scolding Rumi. Robert does that. So there are a couple of Rumis. The scolding Rumi is one of them, and there's 4 translations I've done here, and if you're up to it, I'll read you them. The scolding Rumi. And come in with the father whenever you're, or the little one, or whatever.
Little Rumi.
Let's see. This is the first one I ever realized how strong he was in this area. I don't like it here. I want to go back. According to the old knowers, if you're absent from the one you love even for 1 second, it ruins the whole thing. There must be someone. I mean, just to find one sign of the other world in this town would be helpful. I read it in Des Moines once, and I felt very much what he was saying. There must be someone. I mean, just to find one sign of the other world in this town would be helpful. The great Chinese Simurgh bird got caught in this net. And what can I do? I'm only a wren. My desire body, don't come strolling over this way. Sit where you are. That's a good place. When you choose dessert, you choose something rich.
When you choose wine, you choose something that's clear and firm. What is the rest? The rest is mirages and blurry pictures and milk mixed with water. The rest is self-hatred and mocking other people and bombing. So just be quiet and sit down. The reason is you're drunk. And this is the edge of the roof. And I remember, I think it's in Cleveland or somewhere like that, and there's a lot of people in the poetry reading, and they were some out in a little hallway that way. And when I said those lines, read them for the first time, the reason is you're drunk, and this is the edge of the roof. You could just feel them going like domino.
So I'm curious, what other facets of Robert Bly and his life, what have we not touched on? Because my experience was that he was connected to so many various people in so many various places that I certainly couldn't collect those pieces. And I'm curious if there's anything.
Yeah, there's one thing here, and this allows me to bring in what he says about Vallejo, and it's about the place of thinking in poetry. And I'm going to skip the front part of it. We don't need it. The outcome of this longing of contemporary English poets to want their poetry hooked to history. The outcome of this longing is that the word then is never fresh. The line has fused vertebrae, and that the poem does not convey thinking, but instead contains portraits of ideas, like those wanted posters issued by police departments. But Vallejo's art shows us what it's like not to go about recapturing ideas, but actually to think. We feel the flow of thought, its power, like an underground river, finding its way for the first time through some shifted ground. Even he doesn't know where it will come out. Cesar Vallejo embodies the history of mankind as Jung and Freud do, not by sprinkling the dust of the past on his words, but by thinking his way backward and forward through it. And then Robert goes on and lists the thinkers that Vallejo loved: Marx, Feuerbach, Freud, Socrates, Aristotle, and so forth. I love his fusion of feeling with thinking and the power that those two can convey.
Going back to the rag and bone and related things, one of the beautiful things when Robert and James Hillman and I would work together was James is coming from the realm of thinking, not just thinking, he had feeling also, but boy, he could bring the roots of thinking philosophically and all kinds of other ways. He was deeply knowledgeable of alchemical thought and philosophical thought, psychological thought. And that would connect. I'd be in the middle, like Hillman would be pulling on these roots of the depth of philosophy. You could ask him any question that you wanted about philosophy, he could answer it. And Robert is on the other side, pulling at these roots of the feelings of the soul all over. But Robert had his thoughts also. And it was really an amazing thing. And I know that Robert respected James's thinking, but I know that James also respected Robert's thinking as well as the soulful, emotional stuff. And it was just a really endlessly valuable thing for me to sit between the flowing of those two great minds and great souls with their feelings and the kind of flow of knowledge that could come from either one at any given time. And both of them were aware of the fact that in the modern world, we are adrift from the practices of being together and trying to open all these doors of the senses and of the imagination and of the flow of ideas and of the rush of feelings. Because Hillman had been part of all those meetings with Jung and all of the great thinkers back when Jung was having retreats. And Robert was so connected to so many poets and so many, and there's thoughts inside poetry as well as images. And really they were like living books. And you know, the pages could turn fast, and then suddenly something would come out that hadn't been heard or said for a long time. And it was an amazing experience, you know, for me. And so, yeah, I'm just seconding what you're saying, that Robert would be searching for the thoughts in the poems as well as the images in the poems, and he would be taught by those. And I think that was something that was in the room. Not the idea that, yeah, we could learn from books and that's a great thing. I mean, when I met Robert and Jim, they had each already written 20 books, so clearly books were part of it. But the open book of the soul was primary. And the idea that was that we could learn from the thoughts and the feelings of others in the moment. I mean, I guess I'm just going back to where I was at the beginning. The sense with Robert always was that this next moment could be the moment that we came here for. And that, you know, please take the permission to stand or to be at the edge of the roof, as Robert pulled out of the poem there, and let ourselves fall into the next moment, because it might be there that we find the water or the soil or the love that we were looking for. And I had never met anyone that had that bold a sense of what we're doing here. So I honor that, you know, so thoroughly and repeatedly. And strange, you know, how it is when someone has that irreplaceable quality, then you don't think they could ever depart, you know, and yet we know better. We know better. Yeah, I think it will take a lot of memorial to even come close to expressing all that Robert brought. The thoughts that he brought through that little book of the human shadow, those condensed poetic thoughts about the psyche, that was a gift to I don't know how many people, because the book had like 11 pages, I think. It was a very small book. And little book on the huge human shadow. It should be handed out every time someone wins an election.
On your note about, you know, touching so many people, and I want to just acknowledge all the people in the audience that have said something about their personal experiences, some special moment from their lives. And I know many people are here tonight or today, probably, you know, for the first time, just specifically as an opportunity to find a way to be with their own memories in their own time with Robert Bly. And so I want to acknowledge and thank everybody, you know, that's here for that. And there was a question also that I thought was an interesting question, and to yours, Michael, what are we not touching on yet? I wonder if anybody can speak to his work with Marion Woodman is a question that's been asked.
The last time I sat with Robert was with Marion, and it was probably in the late 80s, I think. And I had this idea for them to write a book together about the intermarriage of the masculine and feminine in fairy tales. And the book never happened, but the experience for me, it was like the third body. There was a kind of, for me, there was the experience of the two of them, a professional or an intellectual relationship that I witnessed. It was like an intermarriage sitting in the room with me. I felt like I experienced the idea of the book in the reality of sitting in their company. I don't know if you had anything like that, Michael, with them, but I really felt like there was a special connection, a soul connection between them, and that it was this incredible privilege that I had. It didn't matter to me. Actually, after a few days, it didn't matter to me that the book wasn't going to happen, because I had this beautiful vision of what was possible in human life. It was a great gift. And Marion was a real mentor to me in many, many ways. So I'm so grateful to both of them.
Thank you. My experience of that was that an unusual gentility of connection that they had. By then I had done a lot of events with Robert of all kinds. And I started to notice that when Robert was with Marion, this gentleness would come out that maybe was hinted at once in a while, but wasn't fully present until they were present. And so I like your image of an inner marriage. And they both were so kind of generous and kind with each other. It made a lot of things possible. So yeah, I can just remember being at those events and then being in conversation afterwards, and just how gentle it was, how kind of
almost protective.
Robert would be protective of that, but
Yeah.
and Marion would also, and how they were coming from very different places in many regards, but they met in this gentle sharing place that was really beautiful. And then they had the courage of sharing that kind of gentle connection with groups of people, and that would open all these practices where women and men would try talking to each other differently and all kinds of things that I would never think of, and that were profound, and that went on for quite a while. And it makes me want to bring in one other close companion of Robert, which is William Stafford.
One of the greatest gifts he's given to poetry in the writing of poetry is his theme of the golden thread. I don't know if you know that theme. Do you know that theme? That if you're going along and a little detail happens, and then Bill said you bring that in. Now, if you're able to follow that, what is the line of Blake?
It says, I give you the end of a golden string. Just wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate built in Jerusalem's wall. That's what Blake says.
And so the idea is that if you have any detail in the morning, and he said a man jogging by his house is fine, and then he follows that, and I said to him, Bill, that every one of them will lead you into Jerusalem's wall? You mean certain special ones, don't you? He said, no, Robert, every detail.
As a writer in practice, my faith is that any old thread will do. Any thread is golden if you don't pull it too hard. And I don't pull those threads very hard. I follow them. Masterful people, watch out, Robert. Break that thread. I don't mean you do, but I mean lots of people who don't write, they think that's the way to do it. Oh, grab it. No, just follow it, roll it.
Suppose that you work for half an hour or so, and you come to something that's a little at the outskirts of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty good.
Do you stop there?
Any suburb will do. What you were saying, I think, is you might get discouraged because you don't get there today. Well, I don't get there today. But I think I have to be ready to accept wherever I do get. It's Jerusalem to me today.
So Haydn, who we've been seeing clips from his film on Robert, made a film about Robert and William Stafford. And they are the two most unlikely poets I've ever seen together. Bill Stafford being small and quiet, not in any way deeply strong, but very quiet about it, and understated and unimposing and undemanding. And I don't think anybody would list those characteristics in description of Robert. Robert, he had presence and he would demand attention and so on. And they became these deep friends. And it was another place where I saw Robert be very protective and very gentle towards William Stafford. I mean, Robert would stand up for ideas. He would stand up to people. He would cause commotion. But with Bill Stafford, like with Marion Woodman, he would be very gentle, and they had this quite gentle connection and this deep friendship. And that was a beautiful thing to experience, you know. And I want to put that, you know, not that it has to be this way, but to feel and experience that gentility of connection man to man between two men who could be rivals in the same field, that's phenomenal. And then similar thing with Marion Woodman. So that is a facet that we haven't talked about, in a sense, that gentle, protective energy that could come out of Robert, and that could be very embracing, not just of another person, but of their work. And that was both a beautiful experience and instructive. So thank you for whoever brought up Marion Woodman, and may she rest in peace.
This is a winter poem about snowbanks. Sometimes in Minnesota, snow will blow down all the way from Canada and then stop 6 feet from the house. So I began the poem with that line. To think about things that go so far, no further. It's called Snowbanks North of the House. Those great sweeps of snow that stop suddenly 6 feet from the house. Thoughts that go so far. The boy gets out of high school and reads no more books. The son stops calling home. The mother puts down her rolling pin and makes no more bread. And the wife looks at her husband one night at a party and loves him no more. And the energy leaves the wine, and the minister falls, leaving the church. It will not come closer, and the one inside moves back, and the hands touch nothing and are safe. And the father grieves for his son, this is Lincoln, and will not leave the room where the coffin stands. He turns away from his wife, and she sleeps alone. And the sea lifts and falls all night, and the moon goes on through the unattached heavens alone. And the toe of the shoe pivots in the dust, and the man in the black coat turns and goes back down the hill. No one knows why he came or why he turned away and did not climb the hill.
There's a beautiful comment in the Q&A I'd like to share. I'm not going to use the person's name because I don't know if she wants it. But she says, until I really believed in my own beauty, I could not see the beauty in others who were different from me or different from what I'd been conditioned to see as beauty. I came to this through Bly, Michael, Mary Watkins, and Dennis Slattery. It's a blessing that many on the screen gifted to me, and I'm grateful. Thank you, dear ones. An aspect of such a memorial as this reminds me of how my soul moves through the world and guides me. By remembering Bly, I'm remembering me.
Beautiful.
Last night at the Myth Salon, I closed out with the Dark Night poem by Robert Bly. And Bly writes, in the night that was dark, made fiery by the furies of love, oh, blessed moment. I left without being noticed. All the doors of my house closed for the night, secure and in the dark, on the secret staircase, stealth, oh, blessed moment. And darkness protected me. All the doors of my house closed for the night, in the delicious night, in privacy where no one saw me, nor did I see one thing. I had no light or guide. But the fire that burned inside my chest, that fire showed me the way more clearly than the blaze of noon, to where, waiting for me, was the one I knew so well. In that place where no one ever is, oh night, sweet guider. Oh night, more marvelous than dawn. Oh night, which joins the lover and the beloved, so that the love and beloved change bodies. I thought it was particularly appropriate that the poem was read on the occasion of not only the winter solstice, but at the tail end of the full moon. And that we would be doing this today to honor that kind of transition of the seasons and the phases of the moon. It seems to awaken all of the spirits of change that we are so governed by. I'm so appreciative that everybody responded to this, that you, Michael, and Kwame, and Dennis, and Connie, and of course, my good friend, Will. We have a moment, and if we don't take a moment to pause when the moment is there, the opportunities disappear. They're like that situation in the Andy Goldsworthy film where he lies on the sidewalk and it rains, and you can see when he gets up where he was. And he says, the only way you can observe change is by staying put. The only way we can observe silence is to stop talking. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to
Thank
have you
you
back,
all.
Michael.
Good to see everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank you,
Just
everybody.
beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, happy holidays, folks.
Happy holidays. God bless Robert.
He would have been 95 tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like the old idea is that when people pass to the other world, they're down below us.
Below us.
And so you can pour some spirit down to them. And they get thirsty down there. That's what I hear. So I'll do the same.
We'll do the same. Thank you for that.
Lots
For the
of
reminder.
love.
Thank you, everyone.
Good
Lots
night,
of
all.
love, everyone.
Honored to have been a part.
No doubt.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks,
Thank you,
Kwame.
Michael.
Thank you.
Connie, Dennis.
See you, Kwame.
Yeah, see everybody. Good seeing
All
you.
right.
Good
Happy
to see
holidays.
Do well.
It is